ni le bien qu'on m'a fait, ni le mal, tout ça m'est bien égal.
Pantarei. Everything is in flux, everything is moving, and even if we step into the same river, after a while, it is not the same river, it is not identical with the one we had been stepping in before. And even if we think there is standstill, there are always others being aware of us and interacting in one way or another, by their fear or by the trust. Pantarei. There is a funny thing about it, a kind of paradox. Well, of course it is anything else than a paradox. It's well known and easy to understand if we have a little bit sense of mathematical reasoning. Albert Einstein, nobody else, made us aware of it, the meaning of relativity as meaning of if we are part of the movement, then we don't really mention it. For us, everything seems to be static, without movement, without change, and it is this that we only mention the changes, the movement, if it is an abrupt change, if we face the revolutionary, the abrupt change of the environment from which we apparently, at least, dissolute. Of course, there are many ruptures every day, small and sometimes large. We perceive them as large, we perceive them differently, and we don't always know what to do with them, how to interpret them. And sometimes we just try at least to ignore them. Try, because of course such changes are in a way dangerous. In a way dangerous as they always question the standards, the meaning of our daily routines. They always tend to question what we are actually doing. So we observe the same and we start from the same point of departure. I remember some words by Albert Einstein in the dispute with Heisenberg, and actually here in Berlin, where he said something of, or something like, what we observe, what we can observe, actually depends on the theory we have. So it is, even if we think there is an objective observation, we just like taking a photograph, the mirroring of something, we think it's just a neutral process, independent of how we approach it. Everybody makes the same photo. There is a difference to it. Even the seemingly same photo depends on the perspective the photographer takes. So far Einstein, and so far a little bit of this theory of the quantum theory that bothers me quite a lot. That bothers me quite a lot in terms of the society we live in. Taste, I started at some stage from this, the beauty as such. Taste is contestable. And in the same way, society is contestable. The society we live in, apparently all the same in one large society, but if we have a closer look, yes, a closer look, we see that society is very much about closure, about division, about dividing people, groups, making them manageable for themselves and for others. It is contestable what we perceive as society. Now, it is obvious there is one large dividing line. That is the social line, that is the class division of society, of today's society, and history, as it had been said, history is the history of class struggles. So far, the Communist Manifesto. And it is this major dividing line that still persists. If we look at so many different things, the high street and the teddies and kicks and whatsoever, the access to the education system, the access to leisure time activities, and a continuing dividing line, even if we think already since the 50s, Helmut Schelsky was talking about the nivellation of the middle class society, the dividing lines not being of any meaning anymore. Still, even about, well, more than 50 years ago, later, they are relevant. They are still persisting and deciding, even within the seemingly one unified society, the position of people. It's of course the larger divide and more visible when we look at the global south and the global north, but even this, and this is important today, even this is changing, that we have, if we want to maintain the terminology, we have a global north in the southern, in the societies of the global south, and we have a global south within the societies of the global north. But there is another dividing line, and I'm not sure how to call it without ending up in very abstract and kind of meaningless terms. There's another dividing line, and I want to try at least to approach it with the following observations. For the time being, it is difficult to grasp it because we face it every day, every second in a way. The feeling, and it is of course linked to the class issue, but it is as well independent of this. The feeling of losing control, the overall alienation, the feeling that something else is ruling, that something is shaping the way we think, the way what we can do, and it is like witnessing the body snatcher and the mind snatcher the body snatcher known from this film, observing that the body and the mind snatcher is there, observing it and not being able to control it, having this fear of witnessing that this body and mind snatcher is just grabbing us and is just approaching, and any attempt to escape is just drawing us closer into the claws of this beast. It's not Frankenstein, or is it? There are so many approaches to it, there are so many attempts to understand what it actually is in history. And this is why I say it's not typical for the class society, at least not typical for the class society in which we live today. Of course, it plays a role and it shapes the way of body snatching and mind snatching, but it is going far beyond this historical period that we call capitalism or modern society. But what is it? What kind of alienation is it that apparently is shaping life, is characterizing our existence since we have been driven out of paradise, if we ever lived in such thing as paradise? What kind of alienation is it, and who, if anybody, is responsible for it? And not least, of course, that's the most important, can we do anything about it? Abyss. This seems to be a very good metaphor on the one hand. At the same time, it is very general, difficult to cope with, because it doesn't really mean anything. It would mean, if there is a physical abyss, it would mean something then. But apparently we are living in safe places and are secure, can move around, get help, get support. And still, there was another term coming up that was alienation. Alienation as something that is especially linked to the analysis of working conditions, where Karl Marx said something like, the worker does not feel content but unhappy, does not develop freely his physical and mental energy, but mortifies his body and ruins his mind. The worker therefore only feels himself outside his work, and in his work he feels outside of himself. He feels at home when he is not working, and when he is working he does not feel at home. Of course, this is a long time ago that this had been written in the economic and philosophical manuscript. And there is, of course, something as well around technology, and this is something we face today even more than we ever had been confronted with. Günther Anders, philosopher, said something, that we are living in a time where everything that is possible in technical terms, has to be done. It's the dominance of the technology, and it is something that is good as such because it is possible, and because of that it has to be done. There is no control, there is no use value, to fall back onto the economic terms, but there is only not an exchange value, but a technological value as such. Don't we have this in social terms as well? Niklas Luhmann talked about legitimation by procedure. If the administrative core of things is okay, if rules are observed, then everything is fine. It's the procedure that gives legitimacy, and there is nothing about content. Is that something Shirley Turkle was speaking about when she says we lost control, or we are losing control with the modern means of technology, of communication that are pushing us towards a friction-free area, a friction-free space of communication, making it possible for the machine to understand what we are talking about, and making it possible to machines to communicate amongst each other. But then we can ask, or we have to ask, isn't that the end of life at the end? The only small things we have still living for is a coffee, of course. Anyway, back to serious issues. End of life and the serious impact of wrong behavior in life. To listening to the news, sometimes I can follow them up very seriously, very concentrated, and in many cases I just listen to them en passant in the background. Something is said, as it had been the other day. I forgot the name, but again, one of these cases, sad cases, serious cases, apparently of Me Too. As I said, I forgot the name. I don't even know if I picked it up at the time, but I picked it up in some way. Namely, I thought, well, this guy is somewhat my generation, possibly, at least in the wider sense, and he said something which I thought was interesting. Standards changed. And this is why I draw this link. I had been somewhat sympathetic at first glance, not knowing what actually happened, not hearing anything about the accusation. But I thought, hadn't been that the time, possibly, or isn't that the generation that had been standing up against this Puritanism, standing up or trying to open minds? Of course, there had been the Commune One, and there had been this extreme attitude. But in general, it was something, I wouldn't say more serious, but more subtle opposition against this conservatism, under the gowns, the dust of 1,000 years, a radical position in academia, and trying to link up with the working class. And it was a general mindset of liberalization, if you want. It had been a social issue, and then hearing the accusation, or actually not hearing anything about the accusation, but in vague terms, in general terms, he as well, I thought, well, yes, the standards changed, and does it actually raise the fear of the return to the deer? I was just the other day in the gallery, and there was supposedly in every German living room the Rembrandt painting with a golden helmet, and I said, well, and on the other wall there was the deer, which was famous at least for the German living room. And it was an expression of the conservative, ultra-conservative, rigid family life. There was no opening. Everything had to be authorized by the family father. That was in the 60s and the 70s. I don't know how long it really took to overcome it. And of course, there was, for me, at least this fear, is that the standard, or are we in danger of going back to that standard? Later, this topic came up again, and I was completely, not shocked, but getting irritated, getting even more unsecure what this was about. When Claudia said, I think quoting as well, what changed is the acceptance. The acceptance of things changed, and what had been seen previously as a kind of peccadillo is now seen as a serious offense. Yes, I hesitated, and I couldn't do anything else than saying, yes, you're right. But I have a problem. I think I'm right too. And she also said something about negotiation. Isn't it a matter of negotiation, of negotiating what is going on? After we talked, actually the next couple of days, my thinking was captured by this tension, and anybody who knows me a little bit knows that this kind of thinking ends up in a kind of nirvana, in a very open, very broad field, without limits, and kind of bringing together very different things. And so I remembered the recent concert, the West Eastern Divan Orchestra, and Mr. Steinmeier, the President of the Federal Republic of Germany. I'll come back later to this to link it. Heisenberg and Bohr, another strand of my thinking, and then the Humboldt Forum and Mr. Burda. Now first the concert and Mr. Steinmeier. Don't ask me why and whatsoever, but I was sitting next to Mr. President, and I kind of ignored this, but I couldn't ignore it, not because of him. You have the small talk or whatsoever, but this is not the important part. What you have is actually in this vicinity, you are confronted with people looking at you, staring at you. The photograph is permanently directed to Mr. President, and it is a kind of alienation, I'd say, of a different kind. Of course, not the workers' alienation, but this alienation of the ruling class untouchable, impossible to approach it, even if we are very close to it. And even if we possibly dislike or don't know about it, there is this importance of it. We have to make photographs, permanently photographs, and capture this importance. Whatever this importance is, I don't know. I wouldn't say these are meaningless people, they are stupid or whatsoever. Maybe they are, but what it is not the appreciation of a personality, but simply the appreciation or the respect for an authority. of course, Adorno comes to my mind, and Hannah Arendt comes to my mind, the authoritarian character and the little Eichmann. There have been many complicated debates on this, but it showed me again another time how much we depend in our societies on authorities. Authorities like Daniel Barenboim, whom I appreciate really as authority in terms of his political engagement and the music, the knowledgeability and his engagement really. But it is as well in, or looking at Mr. Steinmeier, it is as well the, not engagement, the authority of not a person, a position, the presidency. As I said, my thoughts had been swirling around and reaching very different levels and different issues. So one, Heisenberg and Bohr, quantum mechanics, quantum theory. I tried to get a little bit of this, and knowing that I won't get it really, I read biographies, Heisenberg's biographies, and there we are, kind of this abyss walking along the authority, the meaning of authority, but as well the meaning of us, of the small people, of those who are actually doing the work. So just a quote from this biography, a scene where they are sitting together, a friend of Heisenberg, Walter, and his mother, talking about culture, about music, and about physics. And just reading this, Walter's mother, who had been listening attentively, now said something more to herself than to us, as if she were trying to formulate her thoughts as she spoke. The parable of the kings and the wagoners may have quite a different import. Of course, superficially, it looks as if the glory is entirely with the kings, as if the wagoners' work were purely subsidiary and unimportant. But perhaps the very opposite is true. Perhaps the king's glory rests on the work of the wagoners, on the fact that the wagoners have put in many years of laborious effort, reaping joy and success. Perhaps men like Bach or Mozart are kings of music only because for 2 long centuries they have offered so many lesser musicians the chance of reinterpreting their thoughts with love and conscientious attention to detail. And even the audience participates in this careful work as it hears the message of the great musicians. What she applies there to music and to musicians, it can be applied as well to politicians. It plays a role in terms of science, that on the one hand, the authority, the formal authority, the position counts, and at the same time, what we see is only the king, what we see is the result, and we forget about what really is involved. We forget who did actually do the work. Now, possibly the most difficult step from there to the Humboldt Forum and Mr. Burda, one of the media dominant figures in the media industry. And there was an article in a journal, free journal, distributed in connection with the opening of the Humboldt Forum, and where he said, he celebrated himself as donor, as a person who sees it not only as obligation to give money, but as well to mobilize others to give money, those who have, and this was the article was about this, and those who will be celebrated then, depending on how much they spend, the celebration, the permanency, the manifestation of these people in the building. Leaving all the details aside, reading it, reading his story and the story of his son, and of course a much appreciated activity in terms of financing such a forum, again I was thinking about what is about those who are interested. Aren't they equally important? What is about those who are going there and showing their interest, and by the differentiated way of working with what is exhibited, as well shaping arts, shaping the forum, and giving it actually meaning that cannot be given by money, that meaning that is the meaning of history, as people make it, as we all make it, even if history is like a nightmare resting on us. In connection with all this Me Too stuff, I checked on the web. I wanted to know who was the culprit. Didn't find it, but I found a website especially dedicated by the Independent, the UK Independent. And what actually shocked me, was all the news about Me Too and offenders and people who supported the movement and who said, yes, it is as well the responsibility of men, and if we know if we are not the culprits, but if we know somebody else, it is our obligation to engage. There had been advertisements. The first I came across was a bank saying, you know to whom you have to talk. Of course, they didn't link to this, but it was a general thing. You know to whom you have to talk, you know whom you can trust, the bank. Another advertisement was sadly a war game, a simulation of the Second World War. I'm sorry, I cannot understand this. I cannot understand, even if it is an algorithm, there is a human being behind it. How is it possible to make this link, to establish this link between negotiation, trust, and abuse of power? Sexual abuse, changing standards, falling back to other standards. How is it possible to be as irresponsible as that? It's something I will never understand. And I will only understand and accept if you understand as negotiation as well struggle, fight, battle. Jering saying law, the struggle of law, if I remember the title correctly. law is something we have to fight for in terms of rights, not in terms of procedures, but in terms of rights. And I return now to something I said in the beginning, the question of progress, the question of alienation linked to technology now. It's probably most appropriate, having been yesterday in the Brecht museum next to the cemetery, where there are a couple of funny stories around this, but it's most appropriate then to quote from his Galileo. Galileo saying to Sarti, to his pupil, a humanity which stumbles in this age-old milky mist of superstition and outmoded words, too ignorant to develop fully its own powers, will not be capable of developing the powers of nature which you reveal. What are you working for? I maintain that the only purpose of science is to ease the hardship of human existence. If scientists, intimidated by self-seeking people in power, are content to amass knowledge for the sake of knowledge, then science can become crippled. And your new machines will represent nothing but new means of oppression. With time, you may discover all that is to be discovered. And your progress will only be a progression away from mankind. It needs some time to think about it, to think about this borderline, to think about the abyss we are walking, where we appreciate technology and technical things, gadgets, where we need knowledge, and at the same time where we are caught in this obtaining knowledge for the sake of knowledge, without content, without use value, linking it to economics, without justice, linking it to jurisprudence, but to law, to exchange value, and to whatever is possible in technological terms. Can we do anything about it? Because this is the decisive question. I mentioned on another occasion in the previous entry to this diary, it is about closure that may kill. It is about what Papa Francesco said, this capitalism kills. But it is going beyond this, and it is something that we have to be aware of. We have to be aware of, in the extreme cases, we see how it kills. If you ever watched the film I, Danny Blake, this horror story of today's society of closure and exclusion into death. But it is more than that. It is the permanency of walking along an abyss, permanently in danger of falling to the one side or the other side, permanently in danger of falling and not really being able to avoid it. Pantare, everything is in flux, and we have to see how we can swim with it, swim in this river without drowning, because the danger is one that we usually don't see. The danger is drowning, being too much part of it, and not the danger of swimming against the stream. So we return to the beginning. I said there are at least the two tensions. The one is clear, it is the one of classes. Just to quote this one sentence from the Communist Manifesto. I started already earlier with it saying all history is the history of class struggles. Now to quote, the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. Freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guild master and journeyman, in a word, oppressor and oppressed, stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight, that each time ended either in the revolutionary reconstitution of society at large, or in the common ruin of the contending classes. These are the words from the Communist Manifesto, characterizing this divide, this segregation of society, the closure which cannot be maintained. Now coming to the second, there is another reference already made. When I quoted, the worker only feels himself outside of his work, and in his work he feels outside of himself. Looking at today's society, I tried to reword this. The tourist, keen to interpret the world differently, in the light of the moment and ensuring that nothing is changed, feels himself or herself outside of real daily life, away from the ordinariness of routines, life and its beauty, presenting themselves as friction, poor setting where standards apparently do not play a role, because they present themselves as timeless, existing without history, and nevertheless being characterized by permanent change or permanent movement, by a vitality that is actually not anymore visible in daily routines.
Maybe the ones in the supermarket, the big bags. Yeah. Den habe ich noch. Der liegt noch. The vitality
uninterrupted, enjoyable, and as it is static in our view, we do not see the tensions behind it. We just see the movement, we just see that something happens and it seems to be a smooth move. It seems to be the move of holidaymakers, of tourists, passing through something that is static, that is there, and that doesn't know anything about reality, the reality of our daily life.
Je revois la ville en fête et en délire, suffocant sous le soleil et sous la joie. Et j'entends dans la musique les cris, les rires